July 10th, 1983, Lake Tahoe. Hidden Pine Cove on the east shore near Sand Harbor, Nevada. The night is calm and cool. At 11:40 p.m., a hiker on the service road hears a thin, strained scream from the direction of the cove. He sees a brief flare of headlights about 300 meters away, then darkness. No engine, no voices, only water pushing at the sand. Down at the campsite, a cassette player hums at low volume, stuck between tracks. A flashlight rolls in the dirt, its beam wobbling over a folding chair. A single sandal sits beside the fire ring. Ash still breathes from the coals. On the table, plates with half-eaten food and an opened bottle. Nothing is packed. Nothing looks finished. A wristwatch later collected from the site shows 11:23 p.m. It's second-hand jammed. A radio station on the AM band ticks over to the 11:40 time call with heavy static. Somewhere between those two moments, 6 UC Davis students, 3 men, 3 women, vanished. At first light, a canoeist spots the tents still standing and drifts closer, expecting to find sleeping campers. He sees the sandals, the pots, the bikes leaned neatly against a pine. No movement. He paddles back to the marina and calls it in. Deputies arrive. They grid the sand. They note drag lines toward the tree line. They bag a torn shoelace and a bent cassette case. The water looks clean. The shoreline tells another story. In the next section, we rewind to their afternoon at the cove. Who argued? Who wandered off? And what small detail was left on a wooden bench that now defines this disappearance? If a detail already stands out to you, drop your theory below and follow along so you don't miss the next chapter of this cold case. They arrive as a small college group on a summer break. 6 UC Davis students, 3 men, 3 women. They pick Hidden Pine Cove because it's quiet, close to the water, and a short drive from Sand Harbor on the east shore of Lake Tahoe. They bring 2 tents. A cassette clicks into place. An 80s rock song hisses into life. The volume is low, enough to sit behind the chatter. The group moves through chores without hurry. They lay out buns, pack meat into foil, and pass a lighter. One of them mentions a breeze from the water. They laugh about it. Someone tries to strike a match at the wrong angle. The match dies. Another lighter works. The grill catches. Smoke rises in a clean line. The sound of the lake folds into the scene. They take photos as the light shifts. The camera goes around the circle. A wide shot with the cove in the background. A closer shot of hands holding a skewered pepper. A half-framed picture of a bike leaning against a pine. The point is not art. It's proof of a day going well. A few seconds of Super 8 film capture a pan across faces and the fire ring. Quick, shaky, ordinary. These images will later matter because they fix who was present, what they wore, and where the gear sat. One student plays with the lake, not swimming, just crouching at the edge, scooping water into a small jar as a joke. He notes the clarity. Another student writes the word Tahoe and the date in a notebook and draws a short line under it. None of them expect any of this to be evidence. They are recording a day, not building a case file. A small bag with a wallet and keys gets set on a wooden bench. It is meant to be grabbed later. It never moves. This is a quiet detail, but it becomes a hinge. When investigators arrive the next morning, the bag will still be there. The wallet will be inside. The keys will be inside. That one fact will cut against every theory that suggests the group chose to walk away on their own. The students eat. They pass plates. Someone jokes about undercooked meat. Someone else points to the sky and says the stars will be strong if the wind stays down. The cassette flips. A new song starts. The bikes stand in a neat row near the tree line. The flashlights lie together on a folded jacket. The film camera sits on the table so its lens doesn't pick up grit. All of this shows order, not panic. A camp in use. A brief witness account comes from outside the camp. A hiker later tells deputies he saw a single figure walking toward the water along the edge of the trees sometime after dark. He can't say who. He can't say how long. He remembers a light tilt of the head and a slow pace. It is too thin to identify a student, but it lines up with the idea that someone went to the shoreline to rinse a plate or wash hands. It does not prove a fight or a plan to leave. After the meal, the students settle around the fire ring. The coals hum. The cassette plays at a soft level so they can hear the lake. Someone stacks plates near the stove. Someone else shakes sand from a towel. A girl steps away to the water. A boy adjusts the grill and burns a finger and laughs it off. These movements matter only because they anchor the group at the cove late into the night. They show continuity. The camp does not look packed or ready to break down. The film camera comes out again for 2 quick frames. One is a group smile with a flashlight beam cutting across the bottom. The other is a near duplicate, a little blurrier. The last frame on the roll is a partial image that will be torn later. That torn frame is important. It suggests a hand pulled film, or the camera snagged fast against something. It is not by itself a crime scene. It is a flag. The night grows steadier. The wind drops. Water keeps up its soft push along the sand. Voices fall and rise. There is talk about a morning ride on the bikes. There is talk about swimming if the temperature holds. There is a comment about how quiet the East Shore gets once the day boats head in. And there is one decision that nobody marks in real time. The bag with the wallet and keys stays on the bench. It is never moved to a pocket. It is never zipped into a tent. That is the kind of small mistake people make when they feel safe. From here, what we know comes from a layer of records. The photographs and the short film confirm the group's presence and basic layout. 2 tents to the left of the table. The bikes near the pine. The fire ring close to the center. The shoreline. The outside witness remains a weak light. He saw someone walking toward the water. That's all. Investigators cross-check footprints near the shoreline and find overlapping impressions, not a single clear track. Sand and pine needles blur edges. A straight answer is not possible. They note that the bikes were untouched and the tents still staked. They note the bag on the bench. They note the stove, the pot, and a plate with food still on it. They flag the small details, because small details often decide whether a disappearance is voluntary or forced. This chapter ends without a cliff jump. It ends with a picture of normal student life at a campsite. Eating, talking, taking a few photos. A short argument that cools as quickly as it starts. A piece of gear set down in the wrong place and forgotten. A figure seen from a distance by someone who doesn't know them. Nothing in this list screams danger. Yet within hours, the cove will be empty except for those same items, and the case will harden into a cold case file. As we move forward, we focus on what can be verified close to the moment of disappearance. Who was last seen by a reliable witness? what the final photographs show and don't show, which items on the table can be tracked to specific students. We narrow the timeline to the period before the scream that carried across the trees. We also address what the group could not have done based on the objects left behind. They did not pack to hike out, and they did not ride off on those bikes. The following chapter of this case follows the last sightings and the first concrete signs that something snapped. If a detail here changes your view, like the bag left on the bench, say it. Drop your take and keep watching. The next section connects these ordinary moments to the moment everything went wrong, and it shows how a quiet cove turned into the start of a disappearance. Before midnight on July 10, 1983, the 6 UC Davis students were still alive at Hidden Pine Cove. 3 different witnesses placed them there. A hiker walking the service trail saw the glow of their fire. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence is a wristwatch found later in the sand near the tents. It belonged to Evan, one of the students. The hands were frozen at 11:23. Investigators could not say exactly how or why the watch stopped, but they marked it as a possible time of struggle, impact, or sudden break. It fixed the timeline into a narrow window. Something happened between 11:15 and 11:23. There were no outgoing calls. None of the families received a message or a phone ring that night. Between 10:30 and midnight, silence. For a group of 6, in an era where payphones were common and trips were short, the lack of any contact stood out. At around 11:30, a resident living about a kilometer away told deputies he saw a flicker of light deep in the tree line. He thought it was a flashlight beam, bouncing and unsteady. He did not investigate. He admitted later he assumed it was campers heading to the water. That statement became part of the official record. Carlos, one of the group, left behind a notebook. Most of it was filled with notes about the lake and sketches. On one page, investigators found a hurried line. "Someone out there?" The handwriting was rushed, uneven. There was no date or time, but the ink matched the pen Carlos carried on that trip. The camera that Lily had been using also added weight to the record. The film roll showed the group smiling together earlier in the night, time-stamped by the position of the moon in the campfire. But the last frame was torn. The image cut off mid-scene, leaving only part of a blurred shoulder and empty blackness. That ripped frame still raises questions. Did the camera snag in a rush? Was the film pulled out by force? Or did someone simply mishandle it in the dark? Weather reports confirmed that the night was calm. The temperature was mild, around 13 degrees Celsius. No storm, no strong wind, no sudden drop in conditions. Investigators quickly ruled out the idea of a natural disaster or exposure causing a mass disappearance. The most unsettling fact was the sudden break in the record. Up until 11 p.m., that is why from the very start authorities treated it as a mass disappearance. The case file records it clearly. No sign of travel, no sign of packing, no explanation for 6 young people gone within 30 minutes. As we move forward, we turn to what was found the next morning. The abandoned campsite. The food left to burn. The shoes scattered in the dirt. The scene that showed more questions than answers. And the moment the case at Lake Tahoe officially became a mystery. At first light on July 11th, 1983, a man paddling his canoe along the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe approached Hidden Pine Cove. The water was calm. The air was still. He expected to see campers packing up or cooking breakfast. Instead, he found silence. 2 tents stood untouched on the sand. The fire pit still held the faint glow of coals. No voices. No movement. He stepped onto the beach for only a few minutes. What he saw unsettled him. Food sat out on plates. A pot had burned over the coals. 3 bicycles leaned neatly against a pine tree. A cassette player was shut off mid-song. A flashlight lay tipped in the dirt. Nothing looked cleaned or packed. Everything looked frozen in place. The man returned to his canoe and paddled back to the marina. By the time deputies arrived, the scene was already marked as suspicious. The first officers roped off the area. They noted the basics: clear skies, calm lake, cool air. Nothing in the environment explained why 6 students would abandon their camp. The tent still held open sleeping bags. One of them had been pushed aside, as if someone left in a hurry. The entrance flaps on another were unzipped from the inside out, suggesting the campers rushed out rather than packed away. On a wooden bench near the fire ring sat a small bag. It contained a wallet and keys belonging to Mia, one of the students. Officers marked it immediately. Most people don't walk away from their identification and car keys. Beside the bench, on the sand, lay a camera with grit on its lens. The film roll inside had been torn, the final frame ripped mid-exposure. Around the evidence was bagged carefully. Soil was taken from the fire pit, the tree line, and the shoreline. A piece of torn fabric with faint blood on it was collected near the pot. The amount was small, but enough to be preserved. Then came a more striking discovery: a wristwatch belonging to Evan, one of the students, lying in the sand. The hands were stopped at exactly 11:23 p.m. The location of the watch was recorded relative to the tents and the fire pit. Officers sketched the scene by hand. In 1983, there were no drones, no overhead cameras. Every detail had to be drawn or photographed on film. They marked the tents, the bicycles, the fire ring, the bench, and the paths of disturbance. They noted the arrows pointing toward the woods and toward the water. Searchers spread out from the cove. They walked shoulder to shoulder across the sand, then into the low brush at the forest edge. They called out names. Nothing answered back. In one patch of dirt, they noticed a long skid mark nearly 2 meters in length, as if someone had been pulled or had fallen hard. That line was flagged for later analysis. The inventory of belongings told its own story. The tents, the bikes, the flashlights, the wallets, the food, and the cassette player, all were present. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing of value had been taken. The scene looked like a group had been interrupted in the middle of a meal and forced to leave immediately. To deputies on scene, the message was clear. This was not a voluntary departure. People don't leave keys, wallets, food, and bicycles behind. People don't walk away from tents without zipping them shut. The items suggested something sudden, something outside their control. Boats from the sheriff's office searched the shallows near the cove. The surface of the lake gave nothing back. No bodies floated, no overturned canoes, no sign that anyone had entered by watercraft. From shore, no obvious tracks of a boat landing were visible. By mid-morning, the cove was marked, photographed, and logged. But the search team returned at first light. The campsite at Hidden Pine Cove had already raised questions. But what investigators began to document piece by piece made the mystery even deeper. Every item left behind told a story, but none of the stories fit together. The first focus was the ground. Around the fire pit, the sand was a mess of overlapping footprints. Tracks circled and crossed as if several people had moved quickly in different directions. Some impressions matched the size and tread of the students' shoes. Others did not. At least 2 sets of prints appeared larger, heavier, and out of place. And near the edge of the fire ring, a long drag mark carved across the sand. It measured close to 6 feet, pulling toward the tree line. It looked like something, or someone, had been forced across the ground. Just beyond the tents, one of the deputies spotted deep, claw-like scratches on the trunk of a pine tree. The marks were fresh, cutting into the bark in parallel grooves. Embedded in the wood was a dark fiber and traces of dirt. The material didn't match the clothing recovered at the site. In 1983, forensic tools were limited. The fiber was bagged, logged, and sent off, but no real answers would come from it. The sample was simply too small and the technology too early. A dozen yards away, another strange detail. A single shoelace, torn clean through, lay in the sand. The cut was not neat. It looked ripped apart by force, as though it had been yanked hard enough to snap. The shoes it belonged to were missing. No one could identify which member of the group had worn them. The missing shoe would never be found. Closer to the cooking area, investigators gathered around the remains of a cassette player. The plastic casing was dented, bent, and cracked. The tape had spilled out, tangled in the dirt. When technicians played back the portion that survived, they heard only static at first. Then, under the hiss, came the faint thud of something heavy striking metal. A few seconds later, a short, high scream broke through the distortion. It lasted less than a second before the tape went silent. That recording became down near the waterline, another clue. A cheap, disposable lighter lay half buried in the sand. It was the kind sold in convenience stores for $1. Family members later confirmed none of the students carried one like it. The lighter became the first tangible suggestion of an outsider at the scene. And there was the shoreline itself. Investigators saw streaks in the sand leading to the lake. Wet earth clung to the base of a tree as if something had been dragged through water and pressed against it. In the damp sand, they found fragments of small shells mixed into the soil. They were out of place compared to the cleaner beach higher up. It looked as if weight had been pulled down to the edge, but there was no sign of a boat, no oar marks, no cut in the reeds. Whatever had touched the water had vanished. One of the most haunting discoveries was the group's camera. It lay face down in the grit, its lens filled with sand. Inside, the film roll showed a final photograph taken around 10 p.m. It was a clear shot, all 6 students laughing by the fire. But the last frame on the roll had been torn. Only half the image remained, showing a dark blur that no one could identify. The rest of the picture was ripped away. Whether it had been damaged by accident or on purpose, no one could say. The collected evidence was boxed, tagged, and filed. The blood, the shoelace, the fiber, the cassette, the camera. Investigators also submitted all of it for DNA comparison years later, but in 1983 there was little hope. The technology simply did not exist to give them names. Everything was stored away for a future that might offer answers. By the end of the first day, the sheriff's office made an early statement. The scene did not look like a voluntary departure. No bags were packed, no bicycles were moved. No attempt was made to clean or leave in order. Instead, what the evidence showed was conflict, struggle. A group interrupted midnight, forced out of the normal. Yet, despite the signs of violence, there were no bodies, no clear direction of escape, and no vehicle. The next step would be to turn from the objects left in the sand to the people who had vanished from it. Interviews, timelines, and early theories would take over. The investigation would move from the campsite to the wider community, searching for anything that could connect these scraps into a whole. The files from that day leave us with one conclusion. Investigators had plenty of evidence, but no real answers. The only path forward was the formal investigation. Kangsat konyo vachung, yung khongko chaloy. Buk dipteo ladio chabando. Leo hot kotim ramatsik kontil. And to you, watching this now, what do you think really happened that night? Was this a random act of violence, or something planned long before they ever set foot on the sand? Leave your thoughts below, because the more voices on this case, the more pressure to keep it alive. Morning came on July 11th. The call had already reached the Placer County Sheriff's Office. 6 UC Davis students missing from their campsite at Hidden Pine Cove. A sheriff's deputy and 2 patrol units were the first to arrive. They stretched tape across the sand and pine line, marking the perimeter. The camp looked untouched, almost staged in its silence. 2 tents upright, bikes still leaning against a tree. The fire pit cold, but intact. The priority was immediate: search the shoreline. Deputies launched a small motorboat and began sweeping along the east bank. The water was calm, no ripples beyond the morning breeze. They circled near the cove, hoping for any sign: an overturned canoe, floating debris, even clothing in the water. Nothing surfaced. On land, another team moved into the woods behind the campsite. They called out names. They expected at least an echo or some trace of people moving deeper into the trees. There was no response. The silence fed the mystery. By late morning, officers began collecting statements. A hiker said he had seen a flicker of light in the trees near midnight, like a flashlight moving erratically. A fisherman reported strange noises on the water, not clear enough to describe, only that it made him uneasy. A driver on the service road remembered. By midday, the search widened. Patrol boats combed the waters around Sand Harbor. They moved in circles, dragging shallow sonar, scanning every inlet they could reach. Nothing appeared. No boats, no human remains, not even dropped items drifting close to shore. At nearby campsites, tourists were interviewed. Families barbecuing that night heard nothing unusual. Couples walking the beach remembered no large group passing by. The 6 students had not been spotted outside the cove. Evidence from the ground was collected quickly: a scrap of fabric, a broken shoelace, a small amount of blood near a cooking pot. A cheap lighter lying in the sand, not matching anything the families later identified. The cassette player, bent and silent, still held tape pulled and warped. It carried muffled sounds investigators described as metal striking, a short scream, and static. In 1983, this was as far as technology could take them. DNA testing was barely in use. Forensic labs were slow. Everything had to be sealed and stored, waiting for analysis that could take weeks or longer. That delay mattered. While evidence sat in sealed envelopes, the story reached the press. The Tahoe Tribune ran the headline first: 6 UC Davis students vanish on lake. By afternoon, radio stations were repeating the details. A fun summer trip had turned into one of the largest missing person alerts the county had seen. Tourists arriving at Lake Tahoe that week were met with roadblocks, patrol cars, and headlines that spread panic. Sheriff's officials held a short briefing. Their words were cautious. They stated there was no sign of foul play, but also no indication the group left voluntarily. That vague statement satisfied no one. Families pressed for answers. Reporters asked about cult activity, drug deals, or even wild animal attacks. Officials had none of it confirmed. The case had entered a strange middle ground. The students were gone, but there was no evidence of murder, no evidence of an accident, and no proof of escape. Every option remained possible, and that meant no clear direction. For the investigators on the ground, the conclusion was difficult but necessary. That is where the first stage of the investigation stopped. Leads collected, witness statements noted, evidence sealed, families told to wait. The sheriff's office had little else to give, but the questions hung heavier with each hour. If the students did not leave by foot, by bike, or by car, where did they go? If no one saw a boat, how could they have reached the water? If no one heard a fight, what explained the chaos in the sand? The opening days of the case showed one fact clearly. The students had not left Tahoe by choice. Something forced them away from their campsite. But whether it was an accident, an attack, or something else entirely, remained unknown. And so the case turned toward speculation. Officers and the public alike began forming theories. They had evidence, but no explanation. They had clues, but no closure. The story of Hidden Pine Cove had already shifted from a missing persons report to a community-wide mystery. The next part of the story asks, with so little to go on, what theories could possibly explain what happened in that half hour before midnight? A week passed. 6 students were gone. No bodies. No final answers. Investigators had to build theories. Only a few carried weight. The first was the possibility of an outside attack. The campsite itself told a story. The sand around the fire pit was torn up, footprints crossing over each other, marks that looked like people pushed or dragged. A trail about 6 feet long led into the tree line. On one tree, 7 meters from the tents, there were deep scratches. In the grooves, technicians found strands of dark fabric and traces of soil. On the ground nearby, a shoelace had been ripped from a shoe. The cut wasn't clean. It looked like it had been torn under pressure. And then there was the lighter, a cheap plastic one, lying in the wet sand by the water's edge. Families and friends confirmed none of the students carried it. It didn't match any of their belongings. For investigators, it stood out like a foreign fingerprint. Add to that the cassette tape. Down near the waterline, another clue. A cheap disposable lighter lay half buried in the sand. It was the kind sold in convenience stores for $1. Family members later confirmed none of the students carried one like it. The lighter became the first tangible suggestion of an outsider at the scene. And there was the shoreline itself. Investigators saw streaks in the sand leading to the lake. Wet earth clung to the base of a tree as if something had been dragged through water and pressed against it. In the damp sand, they found fragments of small shells mixed into the soil. They were out of place compared to the cleaner beach higher up. It looked as if weight had been pulled down to the edge, but there was no sign of a boat, no oar marks, no cut in the reeds. Whatever had touched the water had vanished. One of the most haunting discoveries was the group's camera. It lay face down in the grit, its lens filled with sand. Inside, the film roll showed a final photograph taken around 10 p.m. It was a clear shot, all 6 students laughing by the fire. But the last frame on the roll had been torn. Only half the image remained, showing a dark blur that no one could identify. The rest of the picture was ripped away. Whether it had been damaged by accident or on purpose, no one could say. The collected evidence was boxed, tagged, and filed. The blood, the shoelace, the fiber, the cassette, the camera. Investigators also submitted all of it for DNA comparison years later, but in 1983 there was little hope. The technology simply did not exist to give them names. Everything was stored away for a future that might offer answers. By the end of the first day, the sheriff's office made an early statement. The scene did not look like a voluntary departure. No bags were packed, no bicycles were moved. No attempt was made to clean or leave in order. Instead, what the evidence showed was conflict, struggle. A group interrupted midnight, forced out of the normal. Yet, despite the signs of violence, there were no bodies, no clear direction of escape, and no vehicle. By late July 1983, the case of the 6 missing UC Davis students was already stalling. The physical evidence had been collected and sealed. Samples of blood, fibers, and soil were packed and sent to the San Francisco Crime Lab. But in 1983, DNA testing was not a routine tool. The backlog was long, the methods were slow, and results often came back weeks later, if at all. Families were told to wait. The public was told to be patient. But patience ran out quickly. The first cracks appeared with a witness statement. A hiker who claimed to have seen movement near the tree line gave 2 different versions of his story. At first he insisted he saw 2 figures close together. Days later he changed his account, saying it might have been only one. That shift raised doubts. Was it just poor memory in the dark, or was he bending under pressure? Reporters seized on the inconsistency. The community began to wonder if the sheriff's department even had reliable leads. Then came the letters. The families of the 6 students began receiving envelopes in the mail. No return addresses. Some letters carried vague threats. They're gone, and you'll never see them again. Others mocked the investigation. Check the water, fools. Investigators could not confirm whether the letters were connected to the case or just cruel hoaxes, but they terrified the families. For parents already living in nightmare, the letters made everything worse. Around the same time, rumors spread fast across the Tahoe Basin. Teenagers from nearby towns became targets of suspicion. Locals whispered about gangs, late-night parties, and outsiders causing trouble near the coves. Some accused a group of rowdy young men who often camped by the lake. Others blamed drifters passing through the area. None of it was backed by evidence, but fear had already poisoned the air. Tension grew between visitors and locals. Small confrontations broke out. Tahoe was no longer just a vacation spot. It was a place with shadows. Then another leak shook the investigation. A fisherman told deputies he had seen a small boat close to Hidden Pine Cove on the night of July. The press turned the case into a storm. Local papers splashed dramatic titles across the front page: "The Phantom of Lake Tahoe," and 6 students wiped away in the night. National outlets soon followed, sending crews to Nevada. For the sheriff's department, every unanswered question became an open wound. Families gave tearful interviews. The public demanded answers. And the more the police failed to provide them, the more they were accused of incompetence. Then came the revelation that broke trust further. A small piece of fabric collected from the tree line, the very sample that could have been crucial, was lost during transfer to the lab. A chain of custody error, the department admitted. They called it a mistake. The community called it negligence. In the eyes of the families, it meant one less chance of finding out what happened. By early August, investigators made a difficult decision. Several active leads had to be suspended. They would not continue daily searches in the woods. They would not dredge more coves without new evidence. They would wait on the lab results, and they would focus on analyzing the distorted cassette tape. It was the only audio clue left. For the families, the pause felt like betrayal. For the public, it sounded like surrender. In response, the families organized. Parents and siblings of the missing gathered at churches and community halls. They held candlelight vigils. They pushed local leaders to install better lighting and patrols around popular camping spots. They spoke to the media again and again, refusing to let the story fade. Their persistence kept the case alive, even when the official investigation seemed frozen. Still, the longer the case dragged on, the weaker it looked. After weeks without a breakthrough, the sheriff's department quietly reclassified the Tahoe 6 file as a complex case. In plain terms, it meant no solid suspects, no clear theory, and no progress. Detectives admitted to the families that they were missing a critical piece. Without it, they could not build a path forward. By late summer, the atmosphere around Lake Tahoe had changed. Families with children avoided the beaches at night. Tourists skipped Hidden Pine Cove altogether. Businesses that relied on visitors felt the drop. The lake, usually alive with music and boats in July. 1 year later, in July 1984, a fisherman came forward with a memory he could not shake. A memory of a figure on the shoreline that night, pulling something heavy toward the water. The sheriff's office logged it as a new lead. The families clung to it as hope. And the public, after a year of silence, asked the same question again. Could this finally explain what happened at Hidden Pine Cove? By the end of summer 1984, the file was marked cold case. No suspect, no recovery. The physical evidence never rose above doubt. The disappearance of 6 UC Davis students at Hidden Pine Cove became a line on a shelf and a bruise on a town. That label did not end the story, it froze it. The families did not stop. They formed Friends of Hidden Pine Cove, a small group with a stubborn purpose. Keep the search alive, raise funds, push for safer campsites. Each July they returned to the shoreline with candles. They cleaned the beach and the trail. They posted handmade safety cards on message boards. Every gathering ended with the same questions and the same silence. UC Davis answered in its own way. The school held a memorial in the quad. Professors spoke plainly about loss, not blame. A scholarship started in the students' names, aimed at environmental science and photography. In a campus commons, a small wall plaque held 6 names. Students walked past it on their way to lab or class. It was not a shrine. It was a reminder that a trip can end and leave no trace. The press did not let go either. Each July, local newspapers ran an update. No new leads, no discovery, just a restatement of the timeline. Now and then a TV docu-crew arrived, filmed the cove at dusk, replayed the cassette hiss, and cut to commercial. The cycle kept the case visible, but it brought no breakthrough. The cold stayed cold. One object became the symbol of the case, the torn film frame. It sat behind glass in a neighborhood photo lab, with permission from the families. People leaned in close to study the ragged edge and the blur of a shape no one could name. That strip of film turned into a quiet emblem of the Tahoe disappearance. Proof that something happened, and proof that the picture was never whole. Late that year, a fisherman described a memory that had followed him for months. A figure on the shore the night of July 10th, pulling something heavy toward the lake. He said the shape moved fast, then was gone. The account fit the "toward water" thread, vague, suggestive, incomplete. It supported a direction, not a conclusion. Without a second witness, without a matching boat record, it could not carry the case forward. As months passed, stories grew around the lake. People spoke of smugglers, others of a drunken fight that spiraled, others of a quiet watcher who had followed the group for days. Hidden Pine Cove earned a reputation it had not asked for. Visitors skipped it after dark. Locals kept their distance. The place where the students had last cooked dinner and laughed became a landmark of a vanishing. Tahoe officials changed a few things. More lights went up at popular pullouts. New warning signs reminded campers to stay in groups and report noise after dark. Rangers boosted night patrols when the crowds were thickest. During peak weekends, some sites tested a simple night register card. Number of people, planned return time, plate number. None of it solved the old case. It did speak to the next one that might happen. Inside county offices, the case left another mark. Chain of custody rules were tightened. Evidence logs got stricter audits. Press leaks drew warnings. When a multi-person disappearance hit the desk, the policy now said, call the state lab early, protect the scene, keep the story simple. These were not dramatic changes. They were the kind that stop small mistakes from turning into permanent holes. Hope shifted to technology. The samples, the tiny blood flecks, the fibers from the tree, the soil with shell grit, went back to storage with a note, retest when feasible. The cassette, warped and faint, was catalogued for future audio work. If tools improved, if digital cleanup could pull a voice from the noise, the timeline at 11:40 p.m. might sharpen. That was the promise the file made to itself. Around the lake, life adjusted. Tourism dipped for a while, then returned with a new edge. Outfitters ran short safety briefings. Parents asked more questions. Community centers held practical classes, map basics, signaling, night camp routines. People still picnicked. They still watched the sunset paint the water. But they kept one eye on the treeline. The questions remained. Who carried the cheap lighter to the waterline and left it there? Who tore the final film frame, and why? If a watcher existed, where did he go? And how did he leave a beach without prints leading to a road or a dock? Each question circled back to the same blank space on the map. There was no neat ending to offer. The students did not return. The cove did not confess. Time added distance, not answers. And still, the case held on. It lived in the small things. A name on a wall. A candle by the sand. A strip of film under glass. The disappearance became part of Tahoe's weather. Something you learned to live with, not explain. In the following chapter of this case, attention turns to the cassette. Modern tools can sometimes lift hidden layers from warped tape, tones, stray words, a second voice under the hiss. If a new pass can fix the pitch drift and clear the mid-band noise, the last minute before the crime might come into focus. If you camped along the East Shore in July 1983, if you launched a small boat late, if you saw a flicker of flashlight near the pines, if you heard a shout carried by water, share what you remember. Small details matter when a cold case is this thin. One clean memory, one old photo, one dock receipt found in a box can change the edge of the story. Hidden Pine Cove still waits for that kind of discovery. 6 students vanished without a trace. 40 years later, the mystery remains. Drop your thoughts below. Every comment keeps their story alive.